From April 2026 onward, only Block 2 and 3 cards will be valid for playing in championships and official tournaments. So that means 1 through 4 will rotate out.
Capacity, so being able to use this to help, keep the format healthy.
Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, Espira, and while I've covered all Bondai games at some point or another, my focus recently has definitely been more so on the Fusion World side and Gundam as that's getting closer to release. However, on the One Piece side, I've also casted regionals and done other events for the game. That said, I think the announcements today have some deeper ramifications that speak to the entirety of the Bondai ecosystem, which is why I really want to hone in on what is happening in terms of rotation with the One Piece card game, what it could mean for other games, why are they doing it, and everything in between. As you guys can see, I literally just got off from helping out with the event, casting some of the Gundam stuff, and I figured the ramifications of everything that was announced post our panel is just so big that it was worth having a discussion over. So to kick it off, let's actually go over explicitly everything that was announced at the One Piece panel, and then we can start breaking it down from there. To kick it off, they announced block icons. This is their way of saying the different blocks. If you've ever played MTG or anything of the sort, very similar concept. Formats will be established with X amount of cards within their block, and once the time period of their legality passes, they will no longer be able to be played in a legal format. So for example, here we've got this Nami. It has the icon of 1, which means that it will not be playable in what most games would call like the standard format after a certain point. So if we shift over to the different icons here, you see that the first icon is between OP01 and OP04, with icon 2 being 5 to 8, and then 3 being 9 to 12. Presumably afterwards, having icon 4 being 13 to 16, I believe. Effectively, what they're describing is a period of legality. That said, any good rotation system has eternal formats. When we look at Magic the Gathering, those are things like Legacy, Modern, what have you. Pokemon technically has extended, but no one plays that, but that's a whole different can of worms. Thankfully, it looks like Bondai has also considered this and will be including a format in which you can play with all cards available, calling it extra regulation tournaments. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunity for cards to be usable in standard once they've rotated out. Reprints have a phenomenal place in terms of balancing a format and allowing the game designers to say that for this period in time, we want these kinds of effects in the game, or we don't want these kinds of effects in the game. So for example, let's take this Nami card that they used as an example. If it gets printed in the future, it'll have an updated block icon, which will then allow it to be legal for the periods of which that block icon is legal for. Having multiple avenues for reprints is obviously great for the price of cards, but additionally, the balancing of formats depending on what you specifically want to see in terms of the design of the game. Then they added on this little other tidbit over in the end where they talk about some of the numbers cards like the Nami and Shanks and so on and so forth. And they say that these above cards will be still usable for standard regulation tournaments. More cards are scheduled to be added. So it almost seems like they're also establishing a little bit of a core set. For you guys who don't know, core sets are usually sets of cards that will be always legal within a format. Their existence is super important in terms of laying the foundational work of a card game. You still want on some level for a color to have a specific kind of removal, or to have access to certain synergies that make the color work as a whole. When we talk about black, you want to make sure that they have certain defensive options or things that can lower cost. When it comes to red, maybe you want specific cards that are able to search things, especially for the Straw Hats. So the fact that we want these cards to exist at least all the time or for a period of time, means that having this like core list of cards allows them to be able to shape the format with having these foundational cards in hand without having to bloat sets with all that additional stuff. So to pull it back now, that's everything that they've announced thus far. Effectively, April 2026 is when we will get a brand new format utilizing this new standard rotation. So why is rotation a thing? Well, we see it in games like Magic the Gathering. Hearthstone actually implemented it, I want to say 3 years after the fact. And a big part of that is, there's two parts to it. A big part that they talked about on the stream was the fact that it keeps the simplicity of cards down so it's easier to get into the game. And this is absolutely the case. The longer a game goes on and the more knowledge you need of previous cards, previous mechanics, overlaps, it is definitely harder for a new player to try to onboard beyond just learning the game, because the depth of knowledge they need to know to be at a point where they can kind of compete or hold their own is that much harder. Secondarily, it keeps the power level of cards down. Because you're not always competing with the entire history of cards available to your game, you know that it's only going to last X period of time, 1 to 2 years, depending on how the game does it. And because of that, you're not forced to always have to push the envelope every single time in terms of power to be able to sell booster packs and sell cards. Rotation saves you from the trappings of things like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example, where the game is completely unrecognizable to where it was because it kept on having to push the envelope. And Bondai is no stranger to the concept of power creep, as you all know, but specifically when it comes to Dragon Ball Masters, it got so far to a point in which the game needed a reboot. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that Japan was finally getting the game and globalizing and all that, but nevertheless, the game is at a point where it's just kind of committed to the power creep because of where the game has gone. By implementing rotation, you ensure that you never have to fight against power levels for so long that you can't explore new interesting design. And for what it's worth, Bondai has been planting these seeds for quite a while, even all the way back with Dragon Ball Masters. As of set 3, you already see block icons. Now, for what it's worth, block icons can often also describe the themes that are going to be explored within a card game, but they do also give the designers the opportunity to be able to explore block formats and or rotation. And they've been dropping this seed for a long time in every single game. In Digimon, it's been a thing since BT6. They've had it in Fusion World since the onset of that game. Same as One Piece, they've been there since the start of the game. And for Gundam, I believe this little beta icon will probably lean to being something very, very similar for the full release of cards. For a lot of their other games, they haven't pulled that trigger. There was one time that they attempted to do kind of like a block constructed format for Dragon Ball Masters, but there were issues there in regards to how they communicated it and the timelines of which they communicated it. This one being a year out gives players a ton of time to adjust and figure things out and kind of be able to swallow the news. That said, rotation does have its trappings. There are things that concern me as someone who is pro rotation. There are still some back and forth in terms of pros and cons. Some of the cons are things like devs kind of resting on their laurels because they know they don't have to push the envelope power wise in terms of what their cards do. Maybe they fall back on very samey designs. That's something that we've been seeing with Fusion Worlds in terms of, at least for me personally, the last 5 sets feels like while we're slowly getting to a place where there's more mechanical depth, a lot of cards from set 1, 2, 3, 4 do a lot of the same thing. So you kind of just feel like you're doing the same things over and over again, but with a different coat of paint. To me, I think the big strength of rotation is that because you're not always fighting power level wise, it means that we can explore brand new designs that may have a chance at actually competing at the table because you're not fighting the best stuff from like 3-4 years ago. And in defense of rotation against people who prefer just ban lists, I think the reality is that doing just power creep is effectively a pseudo rotation where new sets will eventually kick you out of the format and then mix in ban lists, which effectively remove your ability to be able to play the deck altogether. That said, there is definitely a missing piece for those people who, you know, absolutely love being that Nami player or play XYZ strategy and they're known to be that player. And eternal formats are incredibly important for that because the identity of a player who ties with a specific strategy is very important to the longevity of having specific champions and having people to talk about things in the game. That's why the fact that they're already pushing to say that they will support an eternal format, the extra format, I think is super important. And they've said that they're committing to be able to make tournaments with this format. So I just really hope that they double down and actually do provide us tournaments so that those players, those Nami players, those whoever players, do always have a place to go back to. Some of my favorite players in other card games are known to be things like, for Magic Gathering, being a storm specialist or what have you. So the fact that there's still an avenue for those kinds of players to exist and to be able to express themselves via their favorite deck, huge, absolutely monumental. I have to be totally honest though. I never expected Bondai to pull the trigger on something like this, especially not with One Piece. They're like holy grail game. The fact that that's the one in which they want to bite the bullet and give an attempt to rotation at which they've almost never attempted it with any of their other games is very interesting. And the biggest question to me is what game is next? I think it's very clear with Dragon Ball Masters and even where Digimon is now that the games are starting to get to a point where when you get to the age of those games that they're harder to get into. So are we going to see that with Digimon? Are we going to see that with Fusion World? Are we going to see that with Gundam? My biggest thing is as long as the eternal format support is there so that we can always explore those really cool and fun strategies with older cards, I'm all in for a easier to get into, lower power standard format that makes the games accessible but also easier to pick back up. I get out of games all the time, so having standard formats in something like Magic makes it so much more approachable for me to get back into it. And I think these are steps that may have some growing pains at first. I know a lot of people are not fans of this, but I think will hugely benefit the longevity of the game in terms of being able to keep the checks and balances closer to the chest. With that said, I know that this is super controversial. A lot of people are going to be super against it. Let me know in the description down below what you guys think about rotation and stuff like that. And honestly, we'll just have to keep on seeing where these things go. That's it. I'll catch you guys on the next one.